Imagine this. You're deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. The only sounds around you are the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the crackling of your small campfire. You feel safe, tucked away in your sleeping bag, staring up at the vast, endless sky. But then, something changes. A twig snaps. A shadow flickers just beyond the fire's glow. Your heart starts pounding. Because in that moment, you realize, you are not alone. Camping trips are supposed to be a time to escape, to connect with nature, to enjoy the silence. But for some, the silence becomes a living nightmare. Here are 7 camping trips that went so terribly wrong, they'll make you think twice before ever setting foot in the woods again. The first story comes from a man named Daniel, who went on a solo hiking trip in the Smoky Mountains. He was an experienced camper, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened that night. As he settled into his tent, he started hearing whispers, soft, almost unintelligible murmurs just outside his tent. He chalked it up to the wind, until he realized the whispers were forming words. Words he could understand. "Let us in." He sat up, frozen. The voices were not coming from one direction, but all around him. He unzipped his tent just enough to peek outside, expecting to see someone playing a cruel joke. But the forest was empty. The whispers, however, didn't stop. Instead, they grew closer. "Let us in." Panicked, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the trees. And that's when he saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures, just standing there, watching. He didn't wait to see what they wanted. He grabbed his pack and ran, leaving everything behind. The next morning, he returned with park rangers to retrieve his gear. Everything was still there, untouched. But the rangers had one question for him. "Who were you camping with last night?" Because when they checked his campsite, they found dozens of footprints surrounding his tent. Then there's the story of Emily and her 3 friends, who set up camp near a remote lake in Oregon. The first night was peaceful, but on the second night, they all woke up to the sound of a child crying. It was distant at first, but grew louder and closer until it seemed to be right outside their tents. They hesitated. What kind of child would be lost this deep in the forest? Emily stepped outside with her flashlight, scanning the area, but there was no one there. Then, her friend Sarah screamed. She had just unzipped her tent and found a small handprint smeared in dirt on the fabric. But the print was upside down, as if something had been hanging above her tent when it left the mark. That night, none of them slept. The crying eventually stopped just before dawn, and they packed up and left as soon as the sun rose. Later, they found out the lake had a dark history. Decades ago, a family had drowned there, and their bodies were never recovered. Perhaps one of the most chilling encounters comes from a man named Richard. He and his girlfriend had set up camp in the dense forests of Washington, miles away from the nearest town. Everything was perfect, until their last night. As they lay in their tent, they heard something moving outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling them. Richard, armed with a knife, unzipped the tent slightly and peered out. What he saw still haunts him. A tall, gaunt figure standing just beyond the fire, staring at them. But the worst part? It had no eyes. Just dark, empty sockets. The figure tilted its head, then took a step forward. Richard scrambled to grab his girlfriend, and they ran to their car, speeding off into the night. When they returned the next morning to retrieve their gear, the campsite was destroyed. Their tent was shredded, their belongings strewn everywhere. But the most terrifying thing? In the dirt, right where they had been sleeping, was a single word, carved deep into the ground: mine. A group of Boy Scouts camping in the Appalachian Mountains encountered something they still refuse to talk about to this day. One of the boys, Ethan, woke up in the middle of the night feeling sick. He stepped outside his tent for air when he saw something, or someone, moving between the trees. At first, he thought it was a fellow scout, but as the figure moved closer, he realized it was wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it didn't quite understand how to walk. The figure stopped just outside the fire's glow, and Ethan could finally see its face. Or rather, the lack of one. There were no features, just smooth, pale skin where a face should have been. Ethan screamed, waking the others, but by the time they all emerged from their tents, the figure was gone. The scoutmaster insisted it was a nightmare. But the next morning, they found footprints, leading directly to Ethan's tent, then stopping abruptly, as if whatever had been watching him had simply vanished into thin air. In another horrifying case, a couple camping in Utah experienced something that defies explanation. Around midnight, they were awakened by a series of clicking sounds, like someone snapping their fingers over and over again. The sounds echoed from all around their campsite. Confused, they stepped out with their flashlight, searching for the source. That's when they saw it. A tall, humanoid figure, crouched just beyond the trees, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It was making the clicking sounds with its mouth. The couple froze, but the figure suddenly rushed toward them at an impossible speed. They bolted for their car, barely making it inside before the thing reached them. It stood outside their vehicle, clicking its teeth, staring at them through the windshield. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it turned and disappeared into the forest. The couple drove away and never looked back. But what terrifies them the most? The next day, they found claw marks on the car's hood, deep and jagged, as if whatever had chased them had tried to pry the vehicle open. And finally, there's the story of a man named Jared, who camped alone in Alaska. He woke up in the middle of the night to find his tent unzipped. Confused, he looked around but saw nothing. Thinking it was just the wind, he went back to sleep. But then he felt something breathing against his neck. He shot up, heart racing, and shined his flashlight around the tent. No one was there. But when he checked the ground outside, he found a trail of massive footprints, leading directly to his tent, then away into the darkness. The next morning, he packed up and left, but later discovered that the area he had camped in was known for strange disappearances. The locals had a name for the thing in the woods. They called it the Watcher. The wilderness is beautiful, peaceful, until it isn't. When night falls and the fire dies down, when the shadows stretch and the wind carries whispers, remember this. There are things in the woods that do not want to be found. And if you're unlucky enough to encounter one of them, pray that it lets you go.